There it is.
All right. Welcome to a very special episode of From Earning to Learning. It's a special episode because this is our first live stream. Also, tonight I have with me my co author, Elise Burns, and we will be talking about our book, Going Gradeless, Shifting Focus to Student Learning. So, we will take comments, questions. Later, we'll actually be putting a link in the chat. Anybody who wants to join us in the studio and ask us questions directly. So before we get started, I know a lot of you have probably heard me on different podcasts. I'm Dave Franjosa, physics teacher, but Elise, she's new to you. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Elise and let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Elise Burns, and I am also a physics teacher at Pascack Hills High School in Montvale. And I've been teaching for about 30 years or so. I'm mostly physics, some other sciences, some math, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and mostly in New Jersey. So my expertise kind of lays in the area of assessment. I've just always been really interested in how to best get kids to demonstrate what they have learned. And I've tried many different things. I've done project-based learning and all sorts of feedback designs, and especially around the area of rubrics. So that's, they used to call me the rubric queen. So I did lots of workshops on it and all this stuff. So that's where my expertise kind of lies. And I've just loved doing what I do, right? I love the teaching and I love the kids. And it's gotten much, much more interesting in the last several years since Dave and I have started really working together and collaborating.
All right. So, what we're here to discuss is our book, Going Gradeless. All right. So, Elise, do you want to kind of tell them how we got started a little bit? We'll give a little overview and then we'll open it up for audience questions.
Sure. So when we started this, we were trying together to get students to be more engaged in learning. Like as opposed to us driving this bus, we wanted kids to want to learn. And we were having a marked lack of success no matter what methodology we tried, no matter what types of projects we did or types of tests or what lessons we did or labs we chose. We were really interested in getting kids to acquire real knowledge and skills that were useful, not just physics stuff, because most of the kids we teach aren't going to be physicists. So I'd say 99.5% of them at least. So we were really more interested in getting them to learn skills that were transferable. And be able to use these skills not just to do the things that we wanted them to do, but then to give them new situations to apply them to. So that was basically the things we were trying to do. And in the traditional framework, we were really having a tough time.
Yeah. And then, to add to that, one of the things that we've been very aware of, and it's been at the forefront of designing this model, is we didn't want it to be this is what we do. All right. So we know that in order for us to have success, we need everybody to kind of have the same success, and for students to not split their focus and approach learning the same way in every class. So we were trying to design something that was scalable, that other content areas could use, and really just build a platform that wasn't prescriptive, that opened people up where, the students knew exactly what was expected of them, but it allowed for each individual teacher to put their own spin on it. We all knew where we were going. How we got the students there would change. And, that consistency in the learning progressions is really helpful for students. And so that was one of our goals. And, with this model, we needed it to be flexible and we needed it to be sustainable. There was a lot of things that we tried, um, things that were effective that just took too much effort or too much time, and there wasn't that balance between effectiveness and sustainability. And so that was another thing that we were really trying to kind of hone as we develop this model. And what you're about to hear tonight, and when we discuss this, this is 6 years, 6+ years in development, because we've tried a lot of different approaches to education, to teaching, different views on learning. So the shift to a gradeless classroom, that's been about 6 years, but the development of this, I think, goes way beyond that. So, Elise, when we talk about the different strategies, um, what are your thoughts on that?
In terms of what we tried
Yeah,
previously?
yeah, exactly.
Well, like pretty much, as new things were introduced, I would say we were at the forefront of like, sure, we'll try that, like any new strategy that kind of comes down the pike. So, like for example, project-based learning was a big thing, about 10, 15 years ago. And like I jumped on board and we were designing, right? We were designing these big projects and using active physics curriculum to try to like pull all these great ideas together, but it wasn't enough in and of itself. Like it was really cool, but it didn't change student approach, student engagement, their desire to learn, the acquisition of skills. Like none of that really transferred. It was just cool. And that kind of was true all the way, through whether you're talking about inquiry-based experimentation, like standing by themselves, they do not make a difference. And it really wasn't until we pulled out the grades that all of that stuff worked. Not just one of those things, but now any of those things you want to use works within the framework of the gradeless classroom.
So along those lines, how have you seen the interactions and relationships with your students change as a result of moving to this model?
Well, this was my like absolute favorite part, because when I was talking to students previously, it was always like, I know the right way to do it, and you are doing it the wrong way. And I was always just this expert who, was telling them what to do. And we were on opposite sides. Now I get to be the coach. So it's all about coaching kids like, okay, here's where you are right now. And you're doing X, Y, and Z correctly. Let's build on that. So we can take where you are and what do we have to do to get to the next level? And then what do we have to do to get to the next level? Like, and it's all so positive. And the same conversations can happen with parents. So as opposed to saying, well, they just got a 60 on the test, so they must not know anything. It's more about this is what your child can do well, and this is where they have weaknesses, and all you got to do is work on those weaknesses, and here are concrete things they can do. It's so much more powerful and much more friendly and kind, which is nice.
Yeah. So
Lem-
I go ahead.
I was going to ask you a question, but go ahead, finish your thought.
So I'd seen the same thing. So I typically we work with different populations of students. So we teach the majority of the physics classes in our school, and you teach the honors and AP. I teach and CP. That's where we overlapped, and then I teach the CP and the collaborative. And we've seen this same result all throughout, from like our collaborative classes all the way up to the AP classes where, these relationships are improving, and just the interactions and the feedback that we can give our students, it's just so much better than it was in that other model.
Yes, yes. Let me ask you a question. So, one of the biggest challenges is that the front loaded effort. I mean, we do a lot of work ahead of the program. So, how do you suggest that anyone interested in going down that path starts out?
Yeah, well, that's a tough one because the first thing you have to do is just go. You have to do it. You have to try. Um, and that's kind of where I was, and I was having limited success, but um, I just made the decision that what I was doing wasn't working, and I couldn't do the same thing over and over and over again. So yeah, I just made the decision that I'm going to investigate something that's different than what I'm doing, and we'll see what happens from there, and I'll adjust. And just chip away. It's not going to be perfect. And I mean, you know that better than anybody. We shared a classroom, and you saw in that first year where I was implementing that model that I developed, it was very clunky. It wasn't an efficient model, but you know, the students responded, right? So you saw over the course of that year that students that I typically had challenges with were actually engaging, and they were learning and responding in a positive way. And I remember somewhere towards the end of the year, you had said to me, "What are you doing?" Um, and for some crazy reason, you decide to join me. So what did you see like in that first year? Um, that made you hop on board. Actually, before we get to that, I just want to recognize AJ. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the well wishes. Hey, Melissa, living in Connecticut, teaching in New York. Thanks for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat, and I'm going to be putting out a link for anybody who wants to actually join us and ask us questions directly. So you can just come into our studio, and we will be happy to answer any questions that you have. All right. So let's get back to that question. What did you see in that first year, as bad as it was, that made you say, this is what I want to do?
Well, every day you'd come in with something interesting that happened or something interesting you'd see. And it was with the kids who were driving you bananas. Like those kids who all, like the first half of the year, were just like impossible to get any work out of. And you were having like great success. And I thought it was really interesting how you were pinpointing the objectives as the guide for the course. Like, what could the students do? It was just a much more positive spin on giving feedback, which I loved. Um, yeah, but mostly the excitement. And we talked about curriculum all the time and about like what should we teach and how should we teach it and what labs should we do and what labs shouldn't we do. And then it became about not about the artifact, but about what we were talking about with the kids about the skills they were like how they were performing, not just assessing like, oh, you have an A, B, C, D. It was like, what did you do well? And what can you do better next time? Because we're just going to do another one in 2 weeks or in a week or next day, that kind of thing.
So I think that kind of leads right into a question that we got from AJ. So what do we consider success when moving to this model? And I think I'll just piggyback on what you said, is just highlighting what are the things when students can engage in that conversation of, these are the things that I need to do to improve. I think that's a success, right? So it doesn't have to be perfect, but like if you can start there, when they say, okay, I know what's expected of me, I understand what you're telling me, I can receive that feedback and I can improve. Um, yeah, I view that as a success.
Yeah, and I can kind of give you a specific example of that. I was just talking to a young man the other day, and we were looking at the results from the end of the unit. And I asked him, like, how does he feel like he's doing? And he said, I am doing so well in, and he was able to highlight, he was able to say, I am really good at writing up experimental design part of a lab, and I'm really good at problem solving, and I'm really good at graph interpretation, but I'm struggling with graph creation and with writing the conclusion to the lab. And so I wanted to know if you could help me with those things. Like, it was just so specific, and it was very positive. Like, he wasn't upset about it, and he knew that he had time yet to still get to his goals. There's nothing punitive about the feedback that we give. So all he needs to do is know what to do to fix it and get better. And that drive to improve is really what we're looking for, right? That engagement of the kid, as opposed to us dictating what they should do. For them to take ownership of it is really important.
All right. So, um, another thing that I would say is before I made this switch, when I would ask students, what do you need to do to improve? I need to study more.
Yeah, yeah,
I need to come for extra help. I need to work harder.
yeah.
And like it was all these vague things. And now, like Elise is saying, it's the specific. Well, you know, I need to get better at drawing my illustration for a problem. Like I don't quite understand where to put like the given values or whatever it is. Their questions are way more specific to the topic, which gives us more information to help them. All right, so we have another question. Um,
Well, actually, I wanted to like the question that Melissa just wrote in, and actually
yeah,
ties into what you were talking about a little bit earlier, like, how do you get started, right? And that, the getting started part is hard, right? It takes a lot of front loaded effort. But the best place to start is to, I think, to look at your national standards, your math standards. And then because I actually was looking at the math standards for another when we were writing the book, and they already give you sort of a progression, because they start with like what kids in grade 2 should be able to do, and then by grade 5, and then grade 8, they give you a sort of a progression for each skill. But then you have to regroup them in a way that makes sense for your class and for your teaching, and look for themes amongst those skills, not just content, but the themes.
yeah, that this is where I would say find somebody who has that same goal as you, somebody who's looking to make this shift as well. That's going to be really helpful. But we we started with our outcomes. What did we want from our students? And then we went through and we wrote I can statements for everything. Right? You remember that list that we had, and then
Yeah.
we highlighted them different colors. And this process, it took a couple of years to really refine it to what we have now.
I mean, we
But
worked with the intermediate stages, and
yeah,
every year, and still I'm making tweaks to those things.
sure. And like that's the one thing that I would say. If you want to get started, don't worry about it being perfect,
Yeah.
right? Um so just kind of focus on starting. What do you value? All right. What are you looking for your students to leave your class with? And as you go through this process, you're going to refine those. And there is a lot that's in the state standards and the federal standards, the national standards. But you have to unpack them. They're not in language that students can understand. All right. And you're going to see there's a lot of redundancy. And it takes time to sift through that. And you really just have to lay it all out. All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. And when Dave says, like, what do you want students to leave your class with? Like your ideal student, if you could design a student, like the perfect student for your class, what in June, what skills would they have by the time they left? What do you want them to know? What's most important to you that they know?
Yeah. So, as a math teacher, you know, you have to look. There are definitely skills that spiral through, and I know there's definitely specific content that they need to know to apply those different skills or practices, as we refer to them. So, when you talk about those practices, we're talking about things like, do they understand how to read a word problem, or like, set up take the information out of a word problem? And that doesn't matter whether they're looking at quadratics or a different concept. So what are those things that you see that occur in every single unit? And that's where you start with these progressions. And what do you expect them to be able to do with that in a unit that you're teaching in September versus a unit that you're teaching in June? All right. And that's a good place to start. I hope that answers your question.
We should say hi to Hassan in New York City. I
Yeah,
don't know if you saw him.
I did. I had him up there, and the Unprocast. So I've heard a lot of good things about them. I got to check out their episodes.
So why don't you talk to us a little bit about how you helped Grace develop learning progressions for her art classes? What'd you learn from that?
Well, and you know what? This ties into another question, another very good question that Melissa has. So, because I think that regardless of content area, we try to keep our learning progressions under 10. We've varied, we've actually changed what those progressions are. And by looking at those redundancies, and what I mean by that is where these learning opportunities happen in different areas, they're very similar, but you're assessing them in different areas. That can become confusing to students, and it can split their attention. So we kind of condensed them and like went from there. So we found that we've had as few as 8.
I think we once had 7, but that didn't last long.
Yeah.
I have 10 this year.
Yeah.
So
And
for the
so,
last couple of years, actually.
and we use the same standards, but this year, based on the courses that I teach, there's a few of those 10 standards that, or learning progressions, that I'm not going to get to. All right. So it depends. Just because of the makeup of the year, it's just not reasonable, but you have that flexibility. So what I learned when I was helping Grace is this framework applies to any content area. So Grace is my wife. She is an art teacher, and we went through her curriculum, and I'm not an artist at all, but her expertise in art and my understanding of learning progressions, we actually fleshed out something that she's like, yeah, this looks pretty good. And I evaluated her student work with no experience in art, and we came up with this same evaluation of that student work. It was no longer opinion. It was based on, okay, well, to me, I'm seeing these things. And you can actually take that subjective nature out of it and really just focus on, here are the things that need to be included, and here's how I can coach them to the next level. And when you talk about overwhelming, so the number itself isn't necessarily what makes it overwhelming. It's how they're rolled out, how they're discussed. And we unlock different levels. So we have a 6-level rubric, and we only unlock what our targeted level of development is, because even if you only have one learning progression, if you're showing them what they should be able to do in June, but we haven't exposed them to that yet or given them the skills to get there. Well, they're going to look at that, they're going to try and do it. And even that one standard is overwhelming. So it's not necessarily the number, it's how are you rolling them out and how are you supporting them? And that's really what's going to determine whether it's overwhelming or not.
And that's one of the best changes we made was actually like making benchmarks for each unit. And that was a huge shift in our understanding of of our own design, right? We began to realize that our learning progression was actually a ladder. And so you really give them one step. And when you get up to that step, then you take the next step. Because if they try to go from the bottom to the fifth rung, well, you can't do that because you can't reach that high. And so this was a really great change that really shifted the whole framework for me anyway.
Yeah. And, just rethinking how you interact with students and just having that clear focus on this is what we're working on. This is what we want them to accomplish. Here are the discrete steps. And really, it's one or two things that they're going to add to get to that next level. If you're giving a student too much to do, it's overwhelming. And so we have to write lab reports. And so we've broken our lab reports down into very distinct steps rather than giving them an entire lab report, marking the whole thing and saying, all right, hey, go fix it. Now we break it down into, we actually start with the conclusion because that's the easiest thing for them to understand. And we just work on that. And then once they understand that, well, then we work on our experimental design. And then once they understand that, we start to fold in data analysis. And so we keep kind of adding layers as they become proficient with another. And that's really how you limit that, overload on them. So,
and the repetition helps too.
Yeah.
So like the fact is that we have the same 10 standards all year. And so because the labs have the same 3 or 4 standards, starting like in September, there's one, then maybe October, we add another one. And then, by November, there's all of them are in there. And then we just work on those gradually progressing all year, but I'm still assessing them on the same 4 standards. And it's, April, I'm going to do it until June. So they get very familiar with those requirements and they actually get really good at it. And the same thing for tests, like we kind of do the same 4 skills on every test, it makes it really easy to design too.
All right. So here is a question that I'm sure people have that they might not ask. So you're focusing on skills. Does that mean you don't care about content?
Is this a question for me?
Yeah.
Or are you rhetorical? Oh, absolutely. You have content, but content becomes the medium, right, through which you teach the skills. So for me, I feel like I could teach these same skills no matter what units I choose this year. Like I could choose whatever, there's certain things I have to do because of the national standards, the state standards, but the skills cut through all of them. And so doesn't, we teach a lot of content. I mean, it's physics. So like we do all the traditional content, but it's not what the focus is per se, right?
So here, good question from Hassan. So he wants to know what the difference between our model and standards-based grading is. So we started with standards-based grading, and one of the challenges that we saw, we were using a generic rubric that it's a different way of evaluating. So this is really more of a question of, are you giving descriptive feedback or evaluative feedback? And when you talk about standards-based grading, there are learning targets saying, this is what I need you to do. This is the degree of proficiency that you have, right? So there's different words for it. Some people will call it, proficient or like I've seen a lot of exceeding, which has its own challenges there. And so um, the mindset there is just it's still a judgment on how well a student is performing a task. So are they meeting the standard or not? What we're talking about is more of a strengths based perspective where we're taking students through a learning progression where it's not about, we're not judging them on how well are they performing this task. We're seeing, okay, where are you at in this progression? Here are the distinct things that you can do. Each rubric is unique to it's unique to the learning progression that we're talking about. So the language that we have for problem solving is different from the language that we have for arguing a scientific claim or whatever it is. So with the standards-based model, a true standards-based model, you're changing, like everything stays the same except for the degree of how well they do it. The way we approach it is, in order to let's use something that most people are probably familiar with, which is creating an explanation. So it doesn't matter what content area you're in, you have to create an explanation. So in a standards-based model, you'd talk about how well they created that explanation, and you that fall on their proficiency scale. With us, we're talking about, okay, as a beginner, here are the things that you should be doing. All right. And then once you're solidly at that beginner level, we're going to say, okay, so now that you have that foundational skill, we're going to add these things to it. All right. Based on practice and feedback and, the different opportunities that we provide for students. And we'll say, okay, now we're going to progress to the developing level. So we really base our targets on opportunity as opposed to saying, okay, they get it when they get it. It doesn't matter when they get it. And like, I understand all that. And we're all about opportunity. And there's a lot of things that are similar, but really the distinct difference is there are students who still view standards-based grading as a judgment on how well they do. All right. And the population of students that we're trying to move away from grades for are just as negatively impacted by that approach as they are by traditional grades. So there's a lot of practices when, you talk about redo policies and all those other things that we've tried. And we do discuss that at length in our book about, like, what did we see when we tried this and why did we move away from it? Because like we collected data the entire time and we asked our students directly, like, how do you feel about this? Are you learning? Are your skills improving? And then we took that and we looked at what we were seeing. And, as we started moving away from that evaluative feedback to more descriptive feedback, these learning progressions support descriptive feedback in a more uniform way than when we actually tried a standards-based approach. So, it's a long answer, and it took us about 40,000 words in a book to kind of answer. So I hope you see that distinction there. But yeah. Okay.
So we do not ever have students make their own rubric because in my opinion, they don't know where they need to get to. They don't have an understanding of that. And our rubrics are designed to, as Dave was saying, to pull students from beginner level up through, proficient to advanced and maybe even to expert level. And so we're the experts, so we kind of have to outline, like, okay, here is what the expectation is. In order to get to that level, this is what needs to be included. So we design the rubric, we post it the beginning of the year, and then, as we were saying, we unfold it, we uncover those levels as we get to them throughout the year. Like, it's now, the end of March, and or almost April, and I've just opened up in some of my classes, like, advanced, right? Some kids are ready for it and some kids aren't. So that's how we use the rubric.
Yeah, and to get to that point, and I don't know if you're getting to the student choice, if that's the angle that you're taking. And with us, student choice is, what skill do you want us to help you develop, as opposed to, all right, here are all the different options that you have. All right. So let's see. So some follow-ups: making a rubric as a capstone, or rewriting the rubric based on what they learned. Yeah, it wasn't something that we investigated. Yeah, we're having some really good success with what we're doing. So the students definitely have input, and we've actually changed our rubrics, we've changed our language. We've done that based on their feedback, but we haven't actually kind of turned over the keys and let them design it on their own. But their feedback has been instrumental in what we currently have. I hope that answers your question. And so now the toughest question, of course, it comes from my lovely wife. So
I was wondering who Grace Brown was.
yeah. So yeah, brainstorming. Like, look, that's great. We like the challenges, and we're always open to those conversations. That was just, our that's our philosophy on why we didn't. Hopefully that answers your question. All right. So yes, Grace Brown, formerly Brown. So her students still call her that sometimes, but it's only been almost a decade. But
Yeah.
yeah. All right. So in revising our lessons to align with the grading model, what advice do we have for teachers that love their projects, that they know are successful for students, but now they might not align with their new goals? That was one of the hardest things that we had to deal with.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, Elise and I, we fought over that. And I not fought, but
We debated
yeah,
heatedly, like,
yeah,
oh, but I love this lab and it's so great. And it's like, and they have so much fun with this project. And we're like, you know what? It doesn't,
it doesn't fit.
it doesn't fit. So, if you have, like, if you think of, okay, what do I want this ideal student to be like in June? Like, what does this particular project do to get them there? Well, they have a good time with it, like, it works really well. It's really cool. Like, all that's great. But, in all honesty, you can probably tweak almost any project to make it
Yep.
fit what you need. You may just have to reword it. So, like, there were projects that we didn't do. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, well, if we say it, if we reformat it, and make the requirements.
Change the focus.
Yeah, you can just change the focus of the project, but still do the same project. So there's both of those approaches would work.
Yeah. So it feels like putting down your pet. Yeah.
That's
there,
great.
yeah, absolutely. There were some that, it's like, oh, and we
But now
had,
I can't remember them, so they must not have been that great.
I remember a few of them.
Which ones?
The motor lab, that project,
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, we stopped
that,
doing them.
yeah, that one. And it's a great project, but it didn't support where the students were. Like, we were asking too much at the point in the year where it fell. And it was just that time and energy was better focused on, so we pared it down, so we still do like a small version of it. But if you're overwhelming their bandwidth, their mental bandwidth, the capacity, that they have to learn. It doesn't matter what you put in front of them. They may think it's cool, they may have fun with it, but at the end of it, it was just a cool project that they went through. And yeah, it's tough, but you can always kind of take elements of it, change the focus. And if it's really a project that you love, see if maybe you can move it to a different point in the year where it would fit better to where they could show those skills in a different light. So um, had our had our sequence been a little different, we still could have done that motor lab the way that we always have had it come at the end of the year.
Yeah. And I totally agree with Hassan. Like, absolutely. Like, I don't even remember the things we don't do because the things we do are much better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, and look, as long as your students are gaining value and they're moving forward, and you're seeing that positive impact on them, you know, it does take the sting out of it a little bit when you're designing it, and when you're saying we have to move away from this project that I love. It hurts in the moment, but when you see how much further they've gone and how much they've grown as students as a result of you focusing on other things, it does take that sting out of it a bit.
Right.
Getting some great questions.
Yeah.
All right. And once again, if anybody wants to join us, feel free to hop into the studio and you can ask us questions directly. All right. So what else would you like to touch on? So, I got one for you. All right.
Okay.
So you're teaching honors and AP,
And
right?
CP
And
and
CP.
regular.
Yeah. So you're teaching all of those levels. And how do you distinguish between the courses? If we're using the same learning progressions for all, how do you distinguish?
Yeah. So this is so all that stuff we were talking about with all that front loaded work, this is where it pays off because even though I teach 3 different levels of physics and you teach a whole different level of physics, so we've got 4 levels between the two of us, we use the same rubric for all of them. And the difference is what the benchmarks are, the rate at which you open up the learning progression. The learning progression is the same, but the level at which the students are willing to be pushed, right, to like encouraged to achieve is different for like an AP student than it is for someone in regular physics. And first of all, it makes it easy because it enables me to just know what I'm looking for. It's easier to grade stuff. It's easy to distinguish between like what I'm looking for. It also means I can use a lot of the same exact materials for the same class, but my expectations of what they are expected to do with those questions or activities is different. So and then the other really great thing about being able to use the same learning progression is that all we have to do is make a grading translation scale that's different for each course. So the expectation for an AP student is that they should be able to achieve advanced and expert level by the end of the year. That's the design of the class. But in regular physics, they don't need to we won't have time to do all that, nor is the expectation there. So we can set the goals. Okay, whatever as long as you're getting it proficient, maybe a couple of advanced, you're doing fantastic. So that's really a wonderful attribute of this. It really streamlines your grading greatly and your understanding of the expectations.
All right. So another good question from Melissa. Would you recommend having the same learning progressions for an entire sequence
Wouldn't
of the
that be
content?
great?
Yeah. For example, algebra, algebra 2, pre-calc, calc, or different progressions for each. So for us, in science, we have the NGSS. We have our science practices that it doesn't matter whether you're teaching freshman bio or you're teaching, physics, right? They're the um, they're the science practices. Now, you may go more in depth. You could say, okay, this is our learning progression throughout high school for science, throughout high school for math, and freshman year you want to get them to the developing level. Sophomore year you want to get them to proficient, and you could approach it that way. But you'd need a whole lot of buy-in from the entire department for that to happen. So I think we're probably a little ways away from that being a reality. And Elise and I have batted around this idea before that, with the way we do things, we could actually we wouldn't have different levels of the course. We could actually teach all students in the same course. Right. So that was something that we also were working towards with this model is it doesn't matter what ability level you're at, because we're not differentiating work, we're differentiating support. And with any content area you could do the same thing, because your math practices aren't different for those different courses, right? The practices are the same, the content varies. So you could do that. You're probably a ways away from that. Elise, any thoughts on that?
Can I tell them my dream?
Sure.
Okay, so I have this like wild idea that you could have a library of skills for a school that were worded such that, you know, every teacher could pick their own 10 out of them. So for example, Dave mentioned we have a standard called creating scientific explanations, but you could make it more general and just have like writing explanations and making predictions, right? So that could be used in almost any course, right? With this pretty much the same learning progression. And then you would just tailor, then you'd pick artifacts to use for that in your class. So like that would be my dream, is to have like a library of maybe like 50, and then every teacher is just taking whatever, subset of those that they need. That is something that I think is not going to happen anytime soon, but it's good to dream.
Sure. All right. So now, question from Hassan. So if we use our model in a school that requires grades, which we do, our school requires us to report a letter grade. How do we go about assigning and calculating that grade? And first, I want to go on the record as saying I am not opposed to putting a grade at the end of a semester or at the end of the year. As long as it's only for communication. What's happened with grading, it's become currency, right? And that's really where the challenge is. If we just shift the focus, and that's really the whole purpose of the book, is to shift the focus away from just earning that grade to, students actually learning, the grade becomes less of an obstacle than it was before. So how we actually do this, and as Elise mentioned before, we have those benchmarks, and the way that we develop those benchmarks is we looked at what practice opportunities are we going to provide to students? What support will they have? And how many different opportunities will they have to try these skills at the various levels? And we just kind of flesh that out throughout each entire unit. We said, all right, here are the labs we're doing. Here's the skills we're focusing on. This is the practice that they'll have. And then we said, okay, by the end of the year, the students who are the strongest will be able to do all of these things, right? And so that became our benchmark for the A. And then we kind of worked backwards and said, okay, so typically the students who are doing well, but and we went through every grade and said, where do we expect them to be? And everybody has a pathway to that grade, right? Because they have the entire school year for practice and feedback and more practice, that the grade itself doesn't really matter. And so we set up this table that shows them, okay, if this is your goal, here are the skills, the level of proficiency that you need in each of these skills. And then from there we coach them to that level. And we have conversations along the way that say, okay, you're on target, you're ahead of target, let's adjust that up. Or you're not on target for the goal that you set, here's some things that I'm noticing. Or and we can have those conversations. And really all those conversations are around learning and how can they develop skills as opposed to grades. And then at the end of the year, wherever they fall on that chart, say, okay, here's where you're at. And it's not a surprise because their level of proficiency is communicated. We conference with them constantly. So I think we do more assessment now than we did when we were in a graded environment. It's just that assessment results in descriptive feedback and conversations about, here's the next one or two things that you need to do to improve, as opposed to, all right, here's what you did, we're never looking at it again, right? Here's your A, B, C, D, put it in your bag, it's done. So the grade really hasn't been that much of an issue. We publish everything at the beginning of the year. We use it to set goals. And then we just make sure that they know whether or not they're on track for those or not. And in the unfortunate event that we had last year where, we were shut down early, we had those benchmarks so we could actually adjust that. We really didn't have that issue of, how are we going to figure out, we have this last project that's worth 300 points, how are we going to get it in, what are we going to do without that project? And we already knew where students should be on March 13th when we left, so we just kind of adjusted that scale to represent, well, this is where their practice stopped, or their guided practice, and it was more independent. And so we felt that it was unfair to hold them accountable for progressing past that. So
Yeah, and it's hard to it's something hard to describe honestly, without showing you the chart. But well, the way we've designed it, it's really it's really like rungs of a ladder or quantum leaps. So they have to have they have to have a minimum level, right? They can have any standard under a certain level, and then they have to have a certain positive number. So we set lower level so that okay, if you're a B student, you can't have anything at a beginner level, because that's not what B students are. We kind of conceptualize and describe
students who earn a B,
right.
not B students.
Yes, thank you. We kind of have this idea of, okay, you've been teaching long enough, what you expect from a kid who earns a B or who earns an A, and then you can kind of say, okay, well, this is where they need to be, and this is where you are the designer of the course, and then the whole year you spend coaching them to reach that goal. And that's, again, the biggest shift in my point of view is I kind of imagine I'm like a sports coach. What the goals are, and you just got to get there. Otherwise, you're not really playing. You're sitting on the bench. So.
And I think we have somebody who agrees with you, right? So if we have all those standards that they can choose from, as long as students show proficiency in all of those, that's your graduation requirements in your dream school.
Yeah, my dream school, right?
So
one day.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to start wrapping this up. Does anybody have any final questions? So if you have any final questions, pop them into the chat. We appreciate everybody who spent their time with us tonight. We look forward to connecting with you. So you can find me on Twitter, and Elise posts her blog posts, and those are coming out every month. So you can connect with us. We want to be a resource for you if you're looking to move in this way. We're always open to that conversation, and there are a lot of people who helped us along the way, and we'd like to do that for anybody who's looking to move this way as well. All right. So any final questions?
You give us a little blurb, like summarize the book in a sentence.
All right. So the book in one sentence. What can we do to remove all of the obstacles to student learning? So that's really it. So this book is all about just removing all of the obstacles that get in the way of students learning. So
Great. It's a good summary.
all right. Blog link. Yep. So
Thanks, Melissa.
all right.
Thanks, Grace.
All right. And then Twitter handle. So Elise is not actually, you are on Twitter. You gotta
Summer Imagineering.
Yeah.
Oh, I am on Twitter. I don't use it. I'm not Twitter proficient.
Yeah. So all right. Well, thank you all for coming out, and we look forward to talking to all of you later.
All right. I will see you later.